A freezing night, a confused old man shivering in an alley, when a heavily overweight invisible diner waitress named Harper offered him her last $20 and a warm coat. She had no idea she was saving the father of Chicago's most ruthless crime syndicate boss. Now she's his obsession. The rain in Chicago during late October didn't just fall, it bit. It carried a freezing, miserable wind off Lake Michigan that sliced right through the thickest winter coats. Harper Quinn knew this all too well as she lugged a heavy trash bag out the back door of O'Connor's Diner on Lincoln Avenue. Harper was 26 years old, wore a size 22, and had spent the entirety of her adult life being profoundly invisible. When you were a fat girl in a city obsessed with status and sleek appearances, people didn't look at you. They looked through you. They saw a shape, made a quick, usually unkind judgment, and moved their eyes elsewhere. Harper had internalized this long ago. She kept her head down, worked her grueling 12-hour night shifts, serving drunk college kids and exhausted cab drivers, and went home to her cramped studio apartment on Diversey Parkway. Tonight the diner had been hell. The waistband of her polyester uniform had been digging painfully into her stomach all night, chafing her skin raw. Her feet swollen from carrying her heavy frame across the cheap linoleum floor for 12 straight hours, throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. All she wanted was to toss the garbage climb into her beat-up 2008 Ford Taurus and collapse into bed. She hoisted the heavy black bag into the rusted dumpster, the smell of stale grease and rotting onions turning her stomach. As she turned to head back inside, a faint sound stopped her. It sounded like a whimper. Harper froze the icy rain, matting her messy brown hair to her cheeks. She peered into the shadows between the dumpster and the brick wall of the adjacent dry cleaners. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. In this part of the city at 3 a.m., a sound in the alley usually meant trouble. "Per favore," a raspy, weak voice murmured. Harper grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight app, and stepped closer. Huddled against the wet, freezing brick was an old man. He looked to be in his late 70s, but what immediately struck Harper was the bizarre juxtaposition of his state. He was soaking wet, shivering violently, and missing a shoe. Yet the coat he was wearing, though stained with alley mud, was a luxurious, heavy cashmere. Underneath, she could see a silk tie and a tailored vest. This wasn't a typical homeless man. This was someone who had wandered off and gotten terribly lost. "Oh my God, sir," Harper gasped, rushing forward. Her bad knees protested as she dropped heavily onto the wet asphalt beside him. "Are you okay? Where are you hurt?" The old man looked up at her. His eyes were clouded with confusion, his skin a terrifying shade of pale grey. "Cold," he whispered, his teeth chattering so hard she could hear the clicking over the rain. I don't know where my car is. My son was supposed to." He trailed off his eyes, rolling back slightly. Okay, stay with me," Harper said, panic rising in her chest. She stripped off her oversized bright yellow rain slicker, the only thing keeping her dry, and draped it over his shivering shoulders. The freezing rain instantly soaked through her thin uniform blouse, plastering it to her heavy chest and arms, but she didn't care. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Di Domenico," he stammered. "Dom." "Okay, Dom. I'm Harper. We need to get you out of this rain." She looked around desperately. The diner was closed. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, had already locked up the front and left through the side door. If she called an ambulance, it might take 20 minutes to arrive in this weather, and Domenico looked like he was bordering on hypothermia right now. "Can you stand? My car is just right there." Harper pointed to the idling Taurus a few feet away. Domenico nodded weakly, but when he tried to put weight on his legs, he collapsed. Harper didn't think twice. Pushing past her own exhaustion, she wrapped her thick arms around his waist, using her substantial weight and leverage to haul him up. She practically carried him, his arms slung over her broad shoulders, shuffling him toward the passenger side of her car. Once she got him inside and blasted the heater, the severity of the situation hit her. He was burning up with a fever, yet shivering. He kept muttering in rapid-fire Italian, clutching his chest. "Hospital," Harper muttered to herself, throwing the car into drive. "I'm taking you to Northwestern Memorial Dom." "No." Domenico suddenly grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his clouded eyes momentarily sharpened with sheer terror. "No hospitals. Please, they will find me. The bad men." "No hospitals, Harper. I beg you." Harper stared at him bewildered. Dementia, she thought. He was paranoid, but the sheer panic in his voice made her hesitate. He was having a panic attack, gasping for air. If she forced him into an ER, the stress might give him a heart attack. Okay, no hospital," she soothed, pulling the car out of the alley. "I live 5 minutes away. I'll take you to my place, get you dry, and we'll figure out your family in the morning." "Does that sound okay?" Domenico slumped back against the seat, nodding weakly. "You are a good girl," he whispered before passing out. The next hour was a blur of frantic activity. Harper managed to get the unconscious old man up the 2 flights of stairs to her apartment, a physical feat that left her gasping for air and her muscles screaming. She laid him on her worn-out floral sofa, stripped him of his wet, ruined designer clothes, and dressed him in a pair of her oversized sweatpants and a massive baggy t-shirt. She wrapped him in every blanket she owned. When she checked his discarded jacket for an ID, she found nothing but a damp, leather-bound notebook and a small, empty plastic pill bottle. The label read, "Nitroglycerin, Domenico Rossi, heart medication." Harper looked at the empty bottle, then at the pale, sweating old man on her couch. He needed those pills. She checked her bank app, $42.18 in her checking account, until payday on Friday. She grabbed her keys, ran back out into the freezing rain, and drove to the 24-hour Walgreens on Belmont Avenue. She didn't have a prescription, but after crying and begging the graveyard shift pharmacist explaining, she found a confused old man who needed his emergency heart meds. The pharmacist took pity on her and gave her an emergency blister pack. It cost her $38. Back at the apartment, she managed to wake Domenico just enough to place a pill under his tongue. Within 30 minutes, his breathing evened out, and the terrifying grey pallor left his face. Harper sat on the floor next to the sofa, wrapped in a towel, shivering in her wet underwear, because she had given him all her blankets. She watched him sleep, feeling a strange sense of protective warmth over this lost old man. She was exhausted, broke and freezing, but as she laid her head against the armrest of the sofa, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time useful. The sun wasn't even up when the nightmare began. Harper awoke with a violent start to the sound of wood splintering. Before her brain could even register what was happening, her front door was kicked off its hinges, crashing onto the cheap laminate flooring of her entryway with a deafening bang. She screamed, scrambling backward until her wide back hit the wall. 4 massive men in dark suits swarmed into her tiny apartment. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision, their hands gripping matte black handguns with silencers attached. "Clear the kitchen," one of them barked. "Bedroom is clear," another shouted. Harper was hyperventilating, pulling a decorative throw pillow over her chest as if it could stop a bullet. She was wearing an old threadbare tank top and a pair of flannel shorts, acutely humiliatingly aware of her large thighs and dimpled skin exposed to these terrifying strangers. Then a 5th man walked through the ruined doorway. The air in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. He didn't carry a gun, but he was by far the most dangerous thing in the room. He was tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a charcoal grey custom Brioni suit that probably cost more than Harper made in 5 years. His hair was jet black, slicked back, and his jawline looked like it was chiseled from marble, but it was his eyes that froze Harper's blood. They were a dead, icy brown, entirely devoid of mercy. He surveyed the tiny, cramped apartment with a look of utter disgust. His gaze sweeping over Harper's trembling, heavy frame, huddled on the floor. He didn't see a woman. He saw an insect. "Where is he?" the man demanded. His voice was smooth, deep, and laced with a terrifying calm. Who? Harper sobbed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, I don't have any money." The man stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the splinters of her door. He crouched down, bringing his flawless, terrifying face inches from hers. She could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive, mixed with the faint, metallic scent of gunpowder. "Do not play stupid with me," he whispered, grabbing a fistful of her messy hair and jerking her head back. Harper cried out in pain. "You thought you could take a confused old man off the street, hold him for a payday. You have exactly 3 seconds to tell me where Domenico Rossi is, before I let my men paint this cheap wallpaper with your brains." "Matthew, stop." The commanding, raspy shout cut through the room like a whip. The man holding Harper Matthew froze. He let go of her hair and stood up, whipping around. Sitting up on the floral sofa, tangled in Harper's cheap fleece blankets, was Domenico. He looked groggy, but the confusion from the night before was gone. He looked furious. "Papa." Matthew breathed all the ice, vanishing from his face, replaced by a desperate, frantic relief. He rushed to the sofa, falling to his knees beside the old man. "God, Papa, we've been tearing the city apart. When the driver said you wandered off from the restaurant, I thought the Moretti family had taken you." Domenico ignored his son. With surprising speed, the old man swung his arm and slapped Matthew hard across the face. The smack echoed loudly in the small apartment. The 4 armed goons in the room rigidly looked away, pretending they hadn't just seen the terrifying boss of the Rossi syndicate get struck. "You animal!" Domenico spat in Italian, then switched to heavily accented English for Harper's benefit. "You break into this home. You lay your hands on the woman who saved my life." Matthew looked stunned, a red handprint blossoming on his aristocratic cheek. He looked from his father to the sobbing, overweight girl huddled on the floor. "Saved your life, Papa. She's a nobody. She probably lured you here to..." "Silenzio." Domenico roared, though it sent him into a coughing fit. Harper, acting on pure instinct, scrambled up from the floor, grabbed a glass of water from the coffee table, and handed it to Domenico. He took it gratefully, his eyes softening, as he looked at her. "This girl," Domenico said softly, pointing a shaking finger at Harper, "found me freezing in the mud. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I was. She gave me her coat. She carried me up those stairs. And when my heart began to fail..." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the blister pack of nitroglycerin. "She bought me this. With her own money." Matthew's dark eyes widened a fraction. He slowly stood up and turned to face Harper. The disgust was gone, replaced by an intense, piercing calculation that made Harper feel even more naked and vulnerable. He looked at the discarded yellow rain slicker on the floor, then at the blister pack. "Is this true?" Matthew asked her, his voice low. Harper nodded frantically, wrapping her arms around her thick middle, desperately wishing the floor would swallow her whole. I found him in the alley behind O'Connor's. He didn't want to go to the hospital. I just wanted him to be safe." The silence in the room was suffocating. Matthew stared at her, his eyes drifting over her unkempt hair, her tear-streaked, puffy face, and her heavy body. Harper shrank under his gaze, years of bullying and fat-shaming rushing to the surface. She knew what men like him thought of women like her. To a billionaire Mafia boss, she wasn't even human. Matthew reached inside his suit jacket. Harper flinched, thinking he was pulling a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick platinum money clip. He peeled off a stack of crisp $100 bills, at least $5,000, and tossed them onto the coffee table. For the pills and the door, Matthew said coldly. He turned his back to her, dismissing her entirely. Get him up. We're leaving. His men immediately moved forward, gently helping Domenico to his feet. The old man pushed them away weakly and turned to Harper. Grazie, Harper, Domenico said, warmly, taking her plump, trembling hand and kissing the knuckles. You have the heart of an angel. Come, Papa, Matthew snapped impatiently, escorting his father out of the ruined doorway. Before Matthew stepped out, he paused. He looked back over his shoulder at Harper, who was still backed against the wall, clutching her arms. You never saw us, Matthew said, his voice a deadly promise. If you breathe a word of this to the police, to your friends, to anyone, I won't just break your door next time. Understand? Harper nodded vigorously, unable to speak, around the lump of terror in her throat. Matthew held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his dark eyes before he turned and vanished down the hallway. Harper stood in the silence of her ruined apartment for a long time before she finally collapsed to the floor and sobbed. For a week, Harper tried to convince herself it was a fever dream. She used a fraction of the blood money Matthew Rossi had left to hire a local handyman to replace her front door, installing 3 heavy deadbolts in the process. The rest of the money she hid in an old shoebox beneath her bed. She couldn't bring herself to spend it. It felt cursed. She threw herself back into her routine, desperately clinging to her invisible, mundane life. But the shadows of Chicago felt different now. Every black SUV that drove past her on the street made her heart hammer against her ribs. Every large man in a suit made her palms sweat. However, the strangest change wasn't the paranoia. It was her boss, Mr. Henderson. Henderson was a miserable, mean-spirited man who took out his life's frustrations on Harper. He constantly made snide remarks about her weight, gave her the worst shifts, and threatened to fire her if she ate a single fry off a customer's plate. But on Tuesday night, when Harper walked into O'Connor's diner, Henderson practically sprinted to the door to hold it open for her. Harper, good evening, let me take your coat? Henderson stammered, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Harper stared at him, bewildered. I can hang it up myself, Mr. Henderson. Is everything okay? Yes, perfect, fantastic. He squeaked, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. Listen, I adjusted the schedule. No more graveyard shifts for you, only days. And, I authorized a raise, $4 an hour. Harper dropped her purse. What? Just please, Harper. Henderson leaned in his breath, reeking of cheap scotch and sheer panic. If anyone asks, I treat you well, right? I'm a good boss. I respect you. Who would ask? Harper asked, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. Henderson violently shook his head and scurried back to the kitchen, leaving Harper standing frozen by the counter. It was them, the Rossi family. They were watching her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Matthew hadn't just walked out of her life. He had run a background check. He knew where she worked. He knew who her boss was. And he had clearly sent someone to terrify Henderson into treating her better. While most people might find a secret Mafia guardian, angel romantic Harper found it deeply, profoundly terrifying. She didn't want the attention of a man who looked like he murdered people before his morning espresso. She just wanted to be left alone. By the time Friday rolled around, the stress was eating her alive. Her anxiety spiked so high she could barely eat, which was ironic, considering how much comfort she usually found in food. It happened after her shift around 9 p.m. She was walking to her car parked 3 blocks down a poorly lit side street because the diner's lot was full. The wind was howling, rattling the street lamps above. "Hey, big girl." Harper stopped. Stepping out from the shadow of a boarded-up storefront was Ricky "Shiv" Jenkins, a local low-level gangbanger who terrorized the Lincoln Park neighborhood. He was high jittery and holding a switchblade that glinted under the flickering amber streetlights. "Hand over the purse, Porky." Ricky sneered, taking a step closer, waving the blade. "And the keys, let's go." Harper's breath caught. She clutched her worn leather purse to her chest. "Ricky, please. I don't have anything. Just leave me alone." "I said give it here." Ricky lunged forward, grabbing the strap of her purse. Harper, driven by a surge of adrenaline, yanked back with all her weight. Because of her size and low center of gravity, Ricky lost his footing and stumbled forward. Harper shoved him away, trying to run toward her car. "You fat bitch," Ricky snarled, recovering his balance and lunging at her with the knife raised. Harper screamed, throwing her arms up to shield her face. The impact never came. A shadow seemed to detach itself from the brick wall beside them. It moved with blinding, terrifying speed. A massive hand shot out, grabbing Ricky by the throat, hoisting the gangbanger completely off his feet. Harper gasped, stumbling backward against a parked car. Holding Ricky suspended in the air was a giant of a man in a black trench coat. He was easily 6'5", built like a tank. With a sickening crunch, the giant squeezed, and Ricky dropped the knife, choking his eyes bulging out of his skull. Another man stepped out of the darkness. He calmly walked over to the dropped switchblade, picked it up with a gloved hand, and then looked at Ricky. "The boss said nobody touches her," the second man said casually. He then drove his fist directly into Ricky's ribs. The crack of bone was loud in the empty street. Ricky let out a garbled shriek as the giant tossed him into a pile of garbage bags like a broken toy. "Don't ever look at her again, or we cut your eyes out," the giant rumbled. Harper was paralyzed with shock, sliding down the side of the parked car until she hit the wet pavement. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for them to turn on her. Instead, she heard the smooth, terrifying purr of an engine. A sleek, black Mercedes Maybach pulled up to the curb directly in front of her. The rear door swung open. Sitting in the plush leather back seat, bathed in the soft, ambient glow of the car's interior, was Matthew Rossi. He was wearing a pitch-black suit tonight, his collar unbuttoned, looking like a dark prince of the underworld. His icy brown eyes locked onto Harper, who was trembling violently on the pavement. "Get in," Matthew commanded. It wasn't an invitation. No. Harper whimpered, pressing her back against the tire of the parked car. "Please, I didn't tell anyone, I swear. Leave me alone." Matthew sighed a harsh, impatient sound. He uncrossed his long legs and stepped out of the Maybach, towering over her. He didn't look at the bleeding street thug in the garbage. He only looked at Harper. "If I wanted to hurt you, Harper, you would have been dead 6 days ago," Matthew said, his voice lowering to a dangerous velvety timbre. He reached down, offering her his hand. "My father has refused to eat for 3 days. He is driving my men insane. He insists that he will only eat if the kind girl joins him for dinner." Harper stared at his large, immaculate hand. He wants me to come to dinner." "Yes," Matthew said, his jaw tightening, as if the admission physically pained him. And since my father's health is the only thing in this world I care about, you are coming to dinner. Now. I can't. Harper blurted out her insecurities, suddenly screaming louder than her survival instincts. She looked down at her stained diner uniform, smelling of fry grease, and sweat, feeling her heavy thighs spread out on the concrete. Look at me, I'm a mess. I'm disgusting. I can't go to some fancy Mafia mansion like this. Matthew paused. His dark eyes slowly dragged over her form. It wasn't the dismissive, cruel look he had given her in the apartment a week ago. This time he actually looked at her. He saw the way she desperately tried to hide herself behind her purse, the blush of deep humiliation burning on her cheeks. To Harper's absolute shock, Matthew didn't sneer. He didn't laugh. He stepped closer, crouched down, and gripped her chin firmly but gently, forcing her to look into his terrifying eyes. The men in my world respect power, Harper, Matthew said softly, the scent of his expensive cologne wrapping around her. You threw a grown man off balance and fought back. You saved a boss of the commission from dying in an alley. There is nothing disgusting about that. Now take my hand. Trembling, completely overwhelmed by the proximity of this dangerous, powerful man, Harper slowly reached out and placed her plump hand in his. His grip was warm and surprisingly gentle as he pulled her to her feet and guided her into the back of the Maybach. As the car door slammed shut, plunging them into the luxurious darkness of the cabin, Harper realized with sickening clarity that her invisible life was over. She was now a prisoner to the darkest family in Chicago. The ride down Lakeshore Drive was suffocatingly silent. The interior of the Maybach smelled of rich leather and the faint, intoxicating scent of Matthew's cologne. Harper sat pressed hard against the passenger door, her hands white-knuckled around her cheap purse, trying to make her large body take up as little space as possible. She felt a burning shame radiating from her greasy, onion-scented diner uniform. Beside her, Matthew Rossi was perfectly still, staring out the tinted windows at the passing city lights, his profile as hard and unforgiving as carved granite. They turned onto Astor Street in the Gold Coast, one of the most historically affluent and heavily secured neighborhoods in Chicago. The car pulled up to massive wrought-iron gates that silently glided open, revealing a breathtaking limestone mansion that looked more like a European consulate than a private home. Armed men in dark suits patrolled the perimeter, their eyes tracking the vehicle. "Out," Matthew commanded softly as the car stopped. Harper scrambled out her worn sneakers, slipping slightly on the slick cobblestone driveway. She followed Matthew up the wide marble steps and through the towering mahogany front doors. The foyer was a cavernous space of imported Italian marble crystal chandeliers and sweeping staircases. Harper felt like a smudge of dirt on a pristine canvas. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee back to the grimy, comfortable anonymity of her cheap apartment. Matthew. Domenico Rossi stood at the top of the stairs, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. He looked entirely different from the shivering lost man in the alley. Tonight he wore a tailored burgundy smoking jacket. His white hair neatly combed his eyes, sharp and bright. When he saw Harper, a massive, genuine smile broke across his weathered face. "My angel." Domenico descended the stairs with surprising speed for a man with a bad heart. He bypassed his son entirely and pulled Harper into a warm, fierce hug. Harper stiffened, terrified she was going to get grease on his expensive jacket, but Domenico didn't care. "Look at you. You came." "She needed convincing," Matthew muttered dryly, handing his coat to a silent butler who had materialized from the shadows. Domenico pulled back and finally seemed to notice Harper's distress and her soiled uniform. He shot a withering glare at his son. "You brought her here like this. without giving her a moment to prepare herself. "You have the manners of a stray dog, Matthew." Before Matthew could respond, Domenico turned to a stern-looking older woman in a pristine housekeeper's uniform, who stood nearby. "Carmela, please take our guest to the East Wing. Draw a warm bath. Find her something beautiful to wear for dinner." "Yes, Don Domenico," Carmela said, bowing her head. She gestured gently to Harper. "Right this way, miss." Harper wanted to protest, to say she was fine, but the exhaustion and the sheer bizarre reality of the situation silenced her. She followed Carmela through a maze of luxurious hallways until they reached a guest suite larger than Harper's entire apartment building floor. I don't think you'll have anything that fits me," Harper mumbled, her cheeks burning hot as Carmela began opening a massive cedar closet. I'm a size 22. Your boss's clothes won't exactly work." She tried to force a self-deprecating laugh, but it came out sounding like a choked sob. Carmela paused, turning to look at Harper. Her stern face softened. "Signorina, the Rossi family has tailors on call 24 hours a day. But for tonight, I believe we have something perfect." Carmela reached into the back of the closet and pulled out a breathtaking deep emerald green silk wrap dress. This belonged to Don Domenico's late sister. She was a woman of substance like yourself, a true Italian beauty. An hour later, Harper stared at herself in the floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror. The hot bath had scrubbed the diner grease and terror from her skin. The emerald wrap dress draped beautifully over her heavy curves, the luxurious fabric cinching at her waist and flowing elegantly over her wide hips and thick thighs. For the first time in years, she didn't look like a joke. She looked imposing. She looked beautiful. When she was escorted to the formal dining room, the heavy oak doors swung open to reveal a massive table set with fine china and crystal. Domenico beamed from the head of the table, but it was Matthew's reaction that made Harper's heart stumble. He was standing by the fireplace, nursing a glass of amber liquid. When he looked up and saw her, his hand froze halfway to his mouth, the icy, deadened look in his brown eyes shattered, replaced by a flash of raw, undeniable hunger that sent a jolt of electricity straight to Harper's toes. He recovered instantly, his mask slamming back into place, but the air in the room had shifted. It was suddenly heavy, dangerous. Dinner was a surreal blur of decadent food, truffle risotto, perfectly seared filet mignon from Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, and rich red wine. Domenico dominated the conversation, asking Harper about her life, her dreams ignoring her nervous one-word answers. Matthew barely spoke, but Harper could feel his dark eyes tracking her every movement, watching the way her mouth moved, the way the silk shifted over her chest when she breathed. Just as the plates were being cleared, the heavy dining room doors violently burst open. A man covered in blood, his left arm hanging at a sickening angle, stumbled into the room. Two of Matthew's massive guards were trying to hold him up. "Boss!" The bleeding man gasped, spitting blood onto the Persian rug. "It was an ambush. The warehouse on 18th Street. Carmine Moretti. He sent a message." Matthew stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He didn't look angry. He looked lethal. "What message?" The bleeding man locked eyes with Matthew, then his gaze slowly drifted over to Harper, who was frozen in her seat, trembling. "Moretti says he knows about the fat girl," the enforcer choked out. "He knows she's the one who hid your father. He says she's a loose end, and he's going to tie it up." The wine glass in Domenico's hand shattered red wine bleeding over the pristine white tablecloth. "Absolutely not. You cannot keep me here." Harper's voice cracked, echoing off the high ceilings of Domenico's private study. She was pacing furiously, the heavy silk of the emerald dress snapping around her ankles. The terror of the bloody enforcer had quickly morphed into a frantic, trapped panic. Matthew stood behind his father's massive mahogany desk, casually pouring himself a fresh glass of scotch. He was maddeningly calm, entirely unbothered by her outburst. "You're not a prisoner, Harper," Matthew said smoothly, taking a slow sip. "You are a guest, a very heavily guarded guest. I have a job. I have rent to pay. I have a life," she yelled, her chest heaving. "You can't just kidnap me because some rival gang boss knows my name." Matthew set his glass down. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and the temperature in the room plummeted. He walked slowly around the desk, advancing on her like a predator closing in on cornered prey. Harper instinctively took a step back, her back hitting the heavy oak bookshelves. Matthew stopped mere inches from her. He braced his large hands on the shelves on either side of her head, trapping her. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smelling the intoxicating mix of Scotch danger and expensive cologne. "Your boss at O'Connor's has been given a $5,000 bonus and told you are taking a sudden leave of absence." Matthew whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in Harper's chest. "Your landlord has been paid 6 months' rent in advance. Your belongings are currently being packed by my men and will be moved into a secure vault. You have no life out there anymore, Harper. Carmine Moretti is a butcher. If you walk out those front doors, he will have his men drag you into a van. He will torture you to punish my father, and then he will dump your body in the Chicago River. Do you understand me?" Harper squeezed her eyes shut, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Why is this happening to me?" she sobbed quietly. I just gave an old man a coat." Matthew's hardened expression faltered. He stared down at her trembling lips, the soft curve of her cheek, wet with tears. Slowly hesitant, as if approaching a wild animal, he lifted his hand. His rough thumb gently wiped the tear from her skin. The contact was electric, sending a shiver violently through Harper's body. "In my world," Matthew said, his voice stripped of its icy armor, revealing a startling raw exhaustion. "Kindness is a myth. People only give to get something in return. Money, territory, blood. When my men told me you spent your last $40 on my father's medication, I didn't believe it. I thought you were playing an angle." Harper opened her eyes, looking up into his intense brown gaze. "I'm not a player in your games, Matthew. I'm just nobody." "You are not nobody," he stated fiercely, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He looked at her, not with the disgust she was so used to from men, but with a fierce, possessive reverence that terrified her more than the guns. "You are the woman who saved the Don of the Rossi family, and as long as I have breath in my lungs, no one will ever touch you. This house is your fortress now. Get used to it." He stepped back abruptly, the cold mask slipping perfectly back into place. He turned and walked out of the study, locking the heavy doors behind him. Harper slid down the bookcase until she hit the floor, burying her face in her hands. She was alive, but she was trapped. It was a golden cage lined with silk dresses and gourmet food, but a cage nonetheless. Days bled into a week. Harper's existence became a bizarre routine of forced luxury. She wasn't allowed outside the estate walls. She spent her days wandering the massive gardens followed at a discreet distance by armed guards. She read in the sprawling library. She took meals with Domenico, who treated her like a cherished daughter, telling her wild, sanitized stories of his youth in Sicily. Matthew was a ghost. She only saw him in passing, striding down hallways, surrounded by grim-faced men, his suit jacket off, exposing the holstered gun strapped to his ribs. Every time their eyes met, The air sparked with an unspoken, suffocating tension. But he always looked away first. It was on the 8th night that the silence broke. Unable to sleep, wrestling with severe anxiety, Harper slipped out of her suite at 2 a.m. She padded down to the cavernous stainless steel chef's kitchen. Cooking had always been her coping mechanism, when the world was cruel butter and carbohydrates made sense. She found a loaf of artisan sourdough and a block of aged cheddar, turning on the massive industrial stove to make a grilled cheese sandwich. "Do you always cope with stress by eating, or is this a special occasion?" Harper gasped, dropping the spatula. Matthew was leaning against the doorframe, bathed in the dim light of the under-cabinet LEDs. He looked wrecked. His tie was gone, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, and he held a tumbler of straight vodka. There were dark, bruised circles under his eyes. It calms me down." Harper defended defensively, crossing her arms over her thick stomach, suddenly hyper-aware of her plush, oversized pajamas. "Do you mind?" "It's the middle of the night." Matthew slowly walked into the kitchen, setting his glass on the marble island. He looked at the sizzling sandwich in the pan, then up at her. "Make me one," he said simply. Harper blinked in surprise. "You want a grilled cheese?" "I haven't eaten in 2 days," Matthew replied, running a hand through his usually immaculate hair, messing it up. "Carmine Moretti has hit 3 of our shipping warehouses. We are bleeding money and men. I am trying to keep a war from spilling onto the streets of Chicago, and my father is demanding I spend more time socializing with our guest." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "So yes, make me a sandwich, Harper." They sat on opposite sides of the massive kitchen island, eating in silence. For the first time, Matthew didn't look like a terrifying Mafia boss. He looked like a deeply exhausted man carrying the weight of a violent empire on his shoulders. "Is this your whole life?" Harper asked softly, breaking the silence. "Just waiting for the next attack." Matthew stopped chewing. He looked at her, really looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away her defenses. "It is the only life I have ever known. But recently, I have found myself distracted by things that do not belong in this life." His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there. The tension in the kitchen suddenly spiked, becoming thick and heated. Before Matthew could say another word, the kitchen's intercom system flared to life with a deafening, shrieking alarm. Red strobe lights began pulsing outside the kitchen windows, painting the marble floors in the color of blood. "Boss," a panicked voice crackled over the intercom. "Perimeter breach on the north wall. Multiple armed hostiles. They're inside the gates. Moretti's men are inside." Matthew was on his feet in a microsecond, the exhaustion vanishing, replaced by pure, terrifying violence. He drew a heavy Glock from the holster at his waist and lunged across the island, grabbing Harper's arm. "Move!" he roared. "Now!" The limestone mansion erupted into chaos. The deafening crack of automatic gunfire echoed through the cavernous hallways, shattering priceless baccarat crystal chandeliers and tearing through the imported Italian drywall. Matthew's grip on Harper's arm was a vice of steel as he dragged her out of the kitchen and into the narrow, unlit servants' corridors that wound behind the main rooms of the Astor Street estate. Harper stumbled, her heavy thighs burning with lactic acid, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. She was gasping for air terror, squeezing her lungs so tightly she felt like she was suffocating. "Keep moving, do not stop," Matthew barked over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness with lethal precision. He fired 2 blind shots down a cross corridor, and Harper heard a man scream, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. "Matthew, your father," Harper cried out, her chest heaving. "Where is Domenico?" "He's in the reinforced wing with his personal detail. He is safe." Matthew said, kicking open a heavy wooden door that led to the grand foyer. "My men are dying out there. Moretti bypassed the perimeter sensors. That is impossible without inside codes." Before Harper could process the horrifying implication of his words, they stepped into the massive marble-floored entryway. Standing between them and the reinforced steel door of the basement safe room was Declan Hayes, the Rossi family's head of security. Declan was a massive, scarred Irishman who had worked for Domenico for 20 years, but right now Declan's gun wasn't pointed at the front door. It was pointed directly at Matthew's chest. "Declan," Matthew said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. He stepped slightly in front of Harper, shielding her wider frame with his own. "What have you done?" Declan sneered, his finger whitening on the trigger. "Sorry, boss. Moretti offered me the entire Southside operation and a seat at the commission. You've been distracted lately. Soft. Letting this fat diner waitress sleep in the guest wing while we bleed money on the streets. It's bad for business." "You are a dead man," Matthew promised, raising his Glock. But Declan fired first. The gunshot in the marble room was louder than a bomb. Matthew let out a sharp, guttural grunt as the bullet tore through his left shoulder, spinning his large frame around. He collapsed to one knee, his gun clattering across the slick marble floor, sliding completely out of reach. Blood instantly bloomed, soaking through his pristine white dress shirt in a horrifying crimson wave. Declan chuckled, walking slowly toward them, aiming the gun at Matthew's head. "Nothing personal, Matthew. Just a change in management." Harper was frozen. The man who had protected her, the invincible, terrifying Mafia king, was bleeding out on the floor. Declan was going to execute him, and then he was going to kill her. She was just a waitress. She was nobody. She was just the fat girl who took out the trash. No. A primal volcanic rage suddenly erupted in Harper's chest. She looked at Matthew bleeding on the floor, and something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to die, cowering. As Declan stepped within 3 feet, cocking the hammer of his gun, Harper let out a scream that tore her throat raw. She didn't try to run away. She threw herself entirely forward. Declan, expecting her to flee or beg, was caught completely off guard. Harper used every ounce of her 250-pound frame, launching herself like a battering ram directly into Declan's chest. The sheer unexpected mass and momentum of her body hit the enforcer with the force of a freight train. Declan let out a breathless gasp as his ribs cracked under her weight. The gun fired wildly into the ceiling as they both went crashing to the hard marble floor. Harper landed heavily on top of him, knocking the wind entirely out of his lungs. Declan thrashed violently, trying to throw her off, but Harper's low center of gravity and absolute desperation made her an immovable boulder. He punched her hard in the ribs, the pain exploding in her side, but she didn't budge. She scrambled her thick fingers blindly across the floor until she felt the heavy, solid brass base of a standing coat rack. With a feral cry, she gripped the brass base, hoisted it up with both hands, and brought it down violently against the side of Declan's skull. The traitor went completely limp. Harper rolled off him, gasping, her plush pajamas soaked in her own sweat and Declan's blood. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "Harper!" She whipped her head around. Matthew was staring at her from his position on the floor. His hand was clamped over his bleeding shoulder, his face pale, but his dark eyes were wide, with absolute, unrestrained awe. He had just watched a woman most of his men dismissed as weak and invisible absolutely destroy a highly trained hitman. Before Matthew could speak, the front doors violently burst open. Dozens of men in black tactical gear flooded the room. Harper screamed, covering her head, but Matthew painfully raised his good arm. "Hold fire!" Matthew roared. It was the Rossi reinforcements. At the head of the pack was Domenico, flanked by 8 heavily armed guards, his eyes wild with panic until he saw them. "Secure the perimeter!" Domenico bellowed, rushing forward. "Get a doctor. Now!" Matthew ignored his father. He ignored the men swarming the room, dragging Declan's unconscious body away. He painfully dragged himself across the bloody marble until he was sitting right next to Harper. He reached out with his uninjured arm and pulled her heavy, shaking body against his chest, burying his face in her messy hair. "You are magnificent," he whispered fiercely against her ear, his blood staining her pajamas. Absolutely magnificent. The aftermath of the Astor Street siege was swift and brutal. With Declan's treachery exposed, the Rossi family completely decimated Carmine Moretti's organization within 48 hours. The streets of Chicago ran red, but inside the mansion, there was only the quiet beep of medical monitors. 3 days later, Harper sat in a plush armchair in Matthew's private, heavily guarded bedroom. He was propped up against the pillows, his chest bare, a thick expanse of white bandages wrapping his shoulder. He looked tired, but the icy, deadened look that used to haunt his eyes was gone. Harper was nervously twisting the fabric of her oversized sweater. The adrenaline had worn off days ago, leaving behind a crushing wave of her old insecurities. The war was over. Matthew was safe. There was no reason for her to stay in this golden cage anymore. "You haven't looked at me in an hour," Matthew noted quietly, his deep voice filling the quiet room. Harper stared at her lap, her cheeks burning. "I should go, Matthew. The doctors say you're out of the woods. Moretti is gone. I can go back to my life now. You can get back to yours." "My life," Matthew repeated, shifting slightly in the bed. "And what life is that?" This Harper gestured to the opulent room, to the armed guards stationed outside the oak doors. "The glamour, the danger, the beautiful plastic socialites you're used to. I don't fit here, Matthew. Look at me. I'm fat. I'm plain. I'm a waitress who smells like cheap coffee. I was just a pawn in your war. But the war is over." "Stand up," Matthew commanded softly. Harper frowned, but she slowly pushed herself out of the armchair. "Come here." She tentatively walked to the edge of his bed. Matthew reached out with his uninjured arm, wrapping his large hand around her thick waist, and effortlessly pulled her down to sit on the edge of the mattress. He didn't let go. His hand slid up, resting warmly against the curve of her stomach, making her breath catch in her throat. When I look at the women in my world, Harper, I see nothing but fragile, hollow shells. Matthew said, his brown eyes burning with a fierce, possessive heat. They would have run or screamed or fainted when Declan pointed that gun at me. But you... He let out a low, rough laugh. You threw 250 pounds of pure fury at him. You broke his ribs. You saved my life. Harper felt tears prick her eyes. I was terrified. You were a queen protecting her king, Matthew corrected fiercely. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a rogue tear. I'm a man who respects substance, Harper. I respect power. I respect survival. You have all three. Every curve, every inch of you is real. You are the strongest, most beautiful thing I have ever seen. He pulled her down by the back of her neck and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was bruised, desperate, and entirely consuming. Harper gasped, melting against him, her hands instinctively grabbing his uninjured shoulder. For the first time in her 26 years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt worshipped. 3 months later, the opulent ballroom of the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago was completely booked out for the annual syndicate gala. The remaining bosses of the Midwest Commission were gathered sipping champagne, their eyes constantly darting toward the grand staircase. The room fell into a dead, terrified silence as Matthew Rossi appeared at the top of the stairs. He wore a midnight black tuxedo, looking every inch the ruthless king of the city. But no one was looking at Matthew. They were looking at the woman on his arm. Harper stood tall, wearing a custom-made, breathtaking ruby-red velvet gown that hugged every heavy curve of her body flawlessly. Diamonds glittered at her throat, a gift from Domenico, who was beaming from the floor below. Her hair was styled in soft, cascading waves, and her makeup was flawless. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, whispers of her size, whispers of her origins. But Matthew simply cast a single lethal glare over the ballroom, and the whispers died instantly. He lifted Harper's hand, kissing her knuckles exactly as his father had done in that cheap apartment months ago. "Are you ready, Mia Regina?" Matthew murmured a private smile reserved only for her. Harper looked out over the sea of powerful, dangerous men. She wasn't the invisible waitress from O'Connor's anymore. She was the woman who broke a hitman. She was the woman who held the heart of the devil himself. She tightened her grip on Matthew's arm, holding her head high, completely unapologetic of her size, her power, or her place in this world. "Let's go say hello to our guests." Harper smiled. The heavy, invisible girl was dead. The Mafia queen had arrived. Did Harper's incredible transformation from a bullied, invisible waitress into a fierce, unapologetic Mafia queen leave you screaming for more? This story proves that real strength and beauty come in all sizes. If you loved seeing Matthew worship every curve of her body and defend her against the entire criminal underworld, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked it all to save the old man in the alley? Let us know.